Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. So this video is about Margaret Thatcher, 40 years on. So it's 40 years this week since Thatcher became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So that's who she was. That's why she's so famous, because some very young people watching this may not have heard of her, or even if they heard the name, well, I think rings a bell, but don't know anything else about her. So she is known for being the first woman to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for holding office for 11.5 years, the longest serving Prime Minister since the Earl of Liverpool, someone who transformed the United Kingdom for better or for worse. So her legacy is something which is hotly contested. And her legacy is an issue to which I'll return towards the end of this video. So she was born in Grantham in Lincolnshire in 1925. Grantham is this small city, and it has had only one other famous resident, and that was Sir Isaac Newton, who actually came from a farm a few miles outside. So you can read Thatcher's autobiography. It's 2 volumes. There's The Path to Power, which some people thought was a bit egotistical, and the second one being The Downing Street Years. So one of her chapters is A Provincial Childhood. So her father was Alfred Roberts. So Margaret Thatcher was born Margaret Roberts, and her father, he'd left school at 12. He'd been a shop assistant. He'd worked at Oundle School, as in being a shop assistant there. He didn't have enough money to carry on his own education beyond the age of 12, and that was typical for the late 19th century. But he looked after his savings, and he was very parsimonious. He eventually ended up owning three corner shops. And he married late in life, and he had 2 daughters, Margaret and her sister Muriel. So that was that. And Margaret Thatcher's mother was, as Thatcher said, a Martha figure. Now, in these times, these biblical allusions are not so well known, as in a reticent and retiring sort of person who just wanted to get on with housework. And there's this book called Who's Who. So in the United Kingdom, the United States, various other countries, prominent people are asked to write a Who's Who profile of themselves. When you're born, who's your family, and what are your affiliations in terms of politics or golf clubs or social clubs or anything else. Just information we might need to know about you. What are your qualifications? And famously, in Margaret Thatcher's Who's Who entry, she didn't even mention her mother. And people say that's because her mother more or less didn't exist in her life. And as Thatcher said, that there was little glamour or sparkle in her life, and she went to London only once in her childhood. But this is the 1920s and 1930s. There wasn't that much money around, and people didn't travel a great deal. So she was an exceptionally diligent pupil, did very well at school, and then she won a place at Oxford University to read chemistry. That would have been 1943. So the Second World War was raging. Now, her father had been involved in politics in a small way, been elected to Grantham Town Council. He was an alderman. These days we'd say a councillor, but back then the title was alderman. And he did not belong to any political party. At that stage, he'd been more sympathetic towards the Liberals previously. The Liberal Party, by the mid-1940s, was very feeble, and Roberts was gravitating more towards the Conservative Party, though I don't think he ever actually joined the party. He certainly didn't like Labour. So Margaret Thatcher went out to university, and in those days, Oxford was something like 90% male, particularly amongst those who were reading chemistry. As the war was on, the boys could go for just a year or so, often have to go after the war, and if they survived, come back, complete their degrees. Sometimes they're able to squeeze a 3-year degree into 2 years for the sake of the war. But Thatcher was able to do her whole degree. She went to Somerville College. She joined the Conservative Association, and Labour was increasingly popular during the Second World War. Clement Attlee was the Deputy Prime Minister. He was running the domestic affairs of the UK, was Churchill, the Prime Minister, Conservative, was more concerned about the war effort and foreign affairs. What else about Thatcher while she was up there? Anyway, she wasn't allowed to join the Oxford Union, and that was the debating society. It was an all-male society until 1963, but she never complained about discrimination. So she graduated with a first-class degree, and then she went down to London, and she applied for various jobs. And famously, one job when she was rejected, a report was written about her saying, this woman is headstrong and dangerously sure of her own opinion, and things like that, which was, of course, hilariously ironic when you see what her later career comprised of. So she got a job as an industrial chemist. She helped make Mr. Whippy ice cream, for instance, and then she decided she wanted to be a barrister, which is a very high ambition for a woman at the time. Again, a very high majority of barristers were male, but nevertheless, she was called to the bar and began her practice. As she later said, her time at the criminal bar taught her to never admit more than absolutely necessary. And around this time, she met Dennis Thatcher. Dennis Thatcher was 10 years her senior. He served in the Second World War. He'd been married, had a quick wartime marriage. When the war was on, if people had a relationship semi-serious for a couple of months, they got married because he might be killed any day. Well, let's not be too cautious. Is this the right person or not? Just go ahead and do it, because tomorrow we die. So he'd had one of those hasty wartime marriages, which was disastrous. And he found out that his wife was committing adultery, so he divorced her after the war. But in the 1950s, divorce was still highly tendentious and very much disapproved of. It wasn't as much anathema as it had been before the Second World War. They weren't able to get married in the Church of England because the Anglican Church did not remarry divorced people. So Thatcher was brought up a Methodist, incidentally, but she tended to worship in the Church of England later on. So they got married in the Methodist Church, I think Methodist Central Hall in London. And that was that. And ere long, they were blessed with twins, Mark and Carol. Non-identical, by the way, the boy and girl. So Dennis Thatcher, he was from Hertfordshire. We went to one of those better-known schools with haberdasher-asks, and his family is quite well off, and he joined Burma Oil. So in modern terms, he was a multi-millionaire. So Thatcher was free to pursue her political career, and she was very active in the Conservative Party. She stood for election about 1950 and failed, but then she was elected MP for Finchley, that's in London, in 1959, and she was one of very few Conservative women, so bound to be prominent. The youngest Conservative woman in Parliament. So I won't go through her whole career, but she was Education Secretary under Edward Heath in the early 70s. And there used to be free school milk given out to every child. It was an Edwardian thing because some impecunious families couldn't afford to give their children milk. And Thatcher said by the 70s this is ridiculous, even the poorest people can afford milk, so we're scrapping it. And that's why she was famously taunted as Maggie Thatcher Milk Snatcher, as in she took it away from them. Anyway, so then Edward Heath had led the party into 4 elections and lost 3 of them. So famously, he'd lost the February 1974 election. So towards the end of 1974, there was a lot of grumbling in the party about Edward Heath, who'd led the party for 9 years. So he said, let's have a leadership election. And so various people put their hat into the ring. So Keith Joseph was Margaret Thatcher's intellectual guru, but he got himself into trouble because he said that women of low intelligence have too many children, something like that. And people thought this was like being a eugenicist. So he'd unfortunately ruled himself out of the running due to his impolitic words. So she decided to put her name forward. And some people said, oh, well, she's just a stalking horse. You know, she will weaken Heath, then the serious candidates will come through in the second round. Quite a lot of people voted for her because they said if a woman's absolutely obliterating this leadership election, it will look bad for the party. No woman's ever sought the leadership of a British political party. They noted it at the time. Anyway, she won the 1975 leadership contest. That was January 75. So she was leader of the Conservative Unionist Party. She was leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. That was a Labour government under Harold Wilson, which had a wafer-thin majority and had this informal agreement with the Liberals to keep them in office. So the United Kingdom in the 70s had really lost its way and lost its self-assurance. The country was racked by strikes. There was inflation. The government was trying to control prices and incomes. People were only allowed to take a certain amount of money out of the country and things like that. Nevertheless, unemployment was not that high, though it was higher than in the 60s. The 60s had been a time of ebullience, and the 70s was a time of doubt. There was the Ulster conflict, and obviously that spilled over into mainland Britain and things like that. There was a rise of neo-Nazism, there was hostility towards the ethnic minorities. Remember, more people from the Caribbean, from Africa, from South Asia had arrived in the United Kingdom. The Ugandan refugees of Indian origin had been let in a few years before by Edward Heath. And so it was a time of polarization. Anyway, so Wilson handed over to James Callaghan in a shock move in April 1976. So Callaghan, he was actually quite popular as an individual, Sonny Jim, but seen as an ineffectual Mr. Magoo type. And then there were lots of strikes in late 1978, the winter of discontent. And famously, he did that and delayed the general election, put it back to calling it in April 1979. And Margaret Thatcher was swept to office, becoming Prime Minister on the 4th of May 1979, invited to Downing Street to kiss hands, as if the Prime Minister invites her to form a government. And yes, they really do kiss hands. Or some people say, well, really, you just brush the Queen's hand with your lips. What else? Yeah, just a couple of years earlier, when she'd been Education Secretary, there's famously some footage of this. Some school children were asking her about being Prime Minister, and she said, there will never be a woman as Prime Minister in my lifetime. Only 5 years later, she proved herself wrong. So Margaret Thatcher famously created an ism, Thatcherism. We sometimes talk about Blairism. There's no Majorism, there's no Brownism, there was no Cameronism, there's certainly no Mayism. So she's one of the only British Prime Ministers to have an ideology that bears her name. And it continued long after she left office, not just in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. We used to say we're Thatcherite in the noughties. Since 1945, there have been this consensus in British politics, Butskillism, as in named after Rab Butler, the Conservative, being Chancellor Exchequer, and Hugh Gateskill, the leader of the Labour Party for some time, which was really a mixed economy between capitalism and socialism, and extensive public ownership. There was British Gas, British Telecom, British Home Stores, British Oxygen Company, really anything else with British in the name, British Rail, and these publicly owned companies, even British Airways, British Leyland, for the benefit of the public. That was the idea. And obviously there were some private enterprises as well. To avoid the mass unemployment, which led to despair and fury and laid people open to being hoodwinked by cloven-tongued demagogues, would lead to totalitarianism. So Labour and the Conservative Party were not too far apart on this, certainly the moderate wings of both parties. And Thatcher didn't appear to reject that. In a 1979 manifesto, famously she didn't say, and by the way, I'm going to privatise everything in sight. So she came in and she was circumspect at first. She tread carefully. And she said that conquering inflation was more important than keeping unemployment down. So famously, although she did manage to reduce inflation, unemployment started to rise. And Saatchi & Saatchi was the advertising agency which designed her killer 1979 electoral poster, which was this dole queue snaking around and said Labour just isn't working because so many people are unemployed. Now, notoriously under Thatcher, unemployment tripled at one stage. That was the very highest it got. It went down after that. It also depends how you count unemployment, because increasingly people were registered disabled, permanently unable to work, on the sick, and really there's a way of disguising unemployment. And she hugely expanded university education. When she became Prime Minister, about 10% of young people went to university. By the time she left, it was about 25%. Well, admittedly, sometimes it's polytechnics rather than universities as such. And obviously, perhaps the UK needed to be more educated, there were more white-collar jobs, not so many blue-collar jobs by the end. But the other thing it was to disguise unemployment by having these people in tertiary education. So Keynesianism had been the economic orthodoxy for at least 4 decades, as in John Milo Keynes, that world-renowned British economist, and he was really a big spender. Say that, if you save some money, you're putting somebody out of work, and governments should simply spend, and that will stimulate the economy and get things going. I've never studied economics, it probably shows. So Keynes was a liberal, but his ideas were accepted by both Labour and the Conservative parties, broadly speaking. But Thatcher rejected that and said, we'll have monetarism, this new ideology. Now, you could see the meaning of life. That Monty Python film came out in 1981, and it has a scene where there's a slave galley saying, in Britain's under this vicious monetarist regime, an allusion to Thatcherism. So unemployment started to rise, and by 1982 the party was quite unpopular. Though Labour was an absolute shower, the Labour Party were washing all their dirty linen in public and tearing each other apart. Their conferences were anarchic, and there was this Trotskyist group, militant tendency, believed in entryism. The Trotskyist political party was never going to win, so they joined Labour and try and turn it into something Trotskyist. And so there were all these loony left ideas going around about having nuclear-free zones, as though the local council can't do anything about whether you have nuclear weapons in the zone, and saying we're going to give up all our nuclear weapons even if other countries don't, and hugely reduce the defence budget and raise taxation on the rich to 98%, things like that. But despite that, Labour sometimes was ahead in the polls because there was such unhappiness about unemployment rising sharply, and it was very regionally varied. It rose very highly in Northern Ireland, which already had dreadful unemployment at the time, Scotland, Northern England, Wales. Southern England was all right, and that was the Conservative base. So strikes started. There was a minor strike very early in her prime ministership, and she folded. And Heath famously had failed to defeat the miners way back in the early 70s. Who governs Britain? He'd called an election on that in 1974, that being a slogan, who governs Britain? And the answer was, not you, mate. If you even have to ask the question, who governs Britain, then you shouldn't be Prime Minister. You should know it's you. But Thatcher knew that she wasn't ready. And the big beast in the Conservative Party, she thought they had this ugly streak of contempt from her. She came from a lower middle class family, or parents were working class, and didn't quite accept she had a right to be there. So she wasn't too sure of her position, had to shore it up. She anyway began to stock up coal. Anyway, then on April Fool's Day, 1983, this report reached the United Kingdom that it looked like an Argentine flotilla was sailing towards the Falklands. Is this some sort of joke? This is the 1st of April. We know what to expect, but no joke. And I won't go into the Falklands conflict. Should she have given in? Some people saw shades of Suez. Harold Macmillan, former Prime Minister, still living, very old boy, veteran of the First World War, thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a catastrophe. Should we just give in? Should we negotiate, get something out of the Argentines? But no, Thatcher said we're going to fight, and obviously it turned out to be a triumph for the United Kingdom. And she controversially ordered that the Belgrano, this Argentine warship, be torpedoed, even so that it was outside the exclusion zone. She might have said, well, we were fighting, they attacked us, they opened fire on us, so yeah, we sunk their ship. That killed hundreds of their sailors? Yes, we did. They killed some of our sailors. We were just more successful at it than they were. So anyway, some of the Argentines have had the moral courage to say they were entitled to sink it. We were trying to sink them. Anyway, so that was the Falklands, and her popularity shot up. Over a year later, she held the next election. People saying, oh, well, she deliberately engineered the invasion of Falklands so that she could win, so that she'd be re-elected. It's all very convoluted and just doesn't really stand up to a moment's scrutiny. It fails the reality test that she wanted the Argentines to invade, which was a humiliation. The UK wasn't guaranteed to win. The Falklands was so far away. The Argentine commanders are very incompetent. If they'd been a bit smarter, it shouldn't have been even that difficult for them to win, and things like that. And actually, Thatcher had secretly been negotiating about the Falklands beforehand. She'd sent Nicholas Ridley, one of her ministers, to Switzerland with his wife to book into the same hotel as an Argentine diplomat and his wife. The idea that they just bumped into each other in the hotel bar and started chatting, so that if anybody found out about it, it was all deniable. And trying to thrash out some deal. This is about 1981. What if the UK said, all right, we'll give you the Falklands in 99 years, so that all the current Falklanders are dead, but the Argentines still get their islands back and everybody's happy. As the Argentines would say, see, it's their islands, Las Malvinas. Or the Argentines will have sovereignty, but they'll lease them back to the UK forever. Or some sort of agreement. But anyway, that wasn't reached. Well, because the Argentines had tried to use force. After that, Thatcher was not willing to discuss it ever again. So she's got this reputation as being a Eurosceptic. But to begin with, she was a Europhile. There was a single European Act. She'd campaigned in the 1975 referendum for the UK to stay in the European Economic Community, as it then was. It only became the European Union in 1993. Remember, at Thatcher's day, there were, first of all, only 10 member states. Then Spain and Portugal joined, brought it up to 12. So the Conservative Party was very much in favour of the European Economic Community. The Labour Party in 1983 wanted to bring the UK out of the European Economic Community. And West Germany was the economic powerhouse of Europe. And the UK was lagging behind. So she signed the Single European Act in 1986, bringing deeper integration. But as we're going to see, she changed her tune towards the late 80s. And she was a firm unionist. Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom. If most people in Northern Ireland wish to join the Republic of Ireland, fine. Their wishes will be facilitated and Northern Ireland will be transferred to the Republic. And she said, I was brought up a Protestant, so naturally sympathised with the Protestant majority in Northern Ireland. Seemed a staggering thing for me to say. But then again, in the Republic of Ireland, where I'm from, most people say we're Catholics, so yeah, we have fellow feeling for our co-religionists, Catholics in the north. And these days, people in England wouldn't say that. Oh, I'm Protestant, that matters to me. Almost nobody would think that way. But so she wanted to maintain the union. Bobby Sands and various IRA men starved themselves to death. She said, well, they're committing suicide. That's up to them. Where they're not going to get any special regime in prison. That's it. We have some of the most humane prisons on earth. As she very wisely said, Sands is choosing to kill himself. That's not a choice his organisation offered to anybody else. So much focus on him and not all the other people who were being killed while he was on hunger strike, including civilians killed by the IRA. Anyway, but it was a tendentious decision, and there was a lot of Anglophobia around the world because this guy was killing himself. People only go on hunger strike in humane prisons and humane countries where they're adequately fed anyway and kept in hygienic conditions of good medical care anyway, and those are free media to report all these things. For some reason, we never hear about it happening in like North Korea or Saudi Arabia. Anyway, then she still worked to improve relations with the Republic of Ireland, signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement at Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland in 1985, that November, with Dr. Garret Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, inviting civil servants from the south to Maryfield, beside Belfast, to monitor the situation. The Irish government would act as an advocate for the nationalist community, which enraged Unionist opinion. She hadn't consulted the Ulster Unionist Party up until this time, and the Ulster Unionist Party have a high opinion of her. And the Reverend Ian Pace of the DUP denounced her as an evil woman. But that was that, and she wouldn't put it to a referendum. The UK government is entitled to sign agreements about the UK or any portion thereof, and doesn't have to have a referendum. So she said that the pushback from the Unionist community was a lot worse than she thought. They felt very let down. They felt they're being betrayed once again. But here we are, decades later, Northern Ireland still in the UK. So she obviously tried to improve the security situation and also worked to achieve warmer relations between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. But she was absolute hate figure for the Republican movement in Ireland, partly because of her unflinching stand. So apartheid was going on in South Africa then, a system of lawful discrimination against the black majority. And she spoke out against that, but she still allowed trade with the South Africa. She said, let's have no sanctions because that will only deeply impoverish the already deprived black majority. And there were various Commonwealth conferences. The Commonwealth was held to matter rather more than it did back then. And then there was a Commonwealth statement saying that apartheid is an unmitigated evil, and she put her signature to that. And people wonder whether the Commonwealth could even last. If they couldn't achieve concerted action on something as clear-cut as apartheid, was there any purpose in it existing at all? But anyway, the organisation was not dissolved. So she perhaps did more to end apartheid than is generally realised, because she had a civilised relationship with the apartheid government, was able to persuade them, you've got to change, and famously hosted P.W. Botha, the president of South Africa, at Chequers. So the Cold War was on, and she was very much a cold warrior, believing in strong defence, beefing up the armed forces. And the British Armed Forces was far bigger back then than it is now. The army is about 3 times bigger in those days. But there were still some cutbacks in certain areas, particularly in the Royal Navy. And people said, well, that led to the Falklands, selling that aircraft carrier to Australia. And she allowed America to put cruise missiles in the United Kingdom. And there were huge protests about this, particularly at Greenham Common, this site something like 50 miles west of London. And Reagan became president in January 1981, and she had a very well-known cordial relationship with Reagan. They were ideological soulmates. So she said she wanted to see the Labour Party improve, and she said it's much better in the United States where Republicans and Democrats are trying to achieve the same thing in different ways. And people say her major effect on British politics was to change the Labour Party, to make them drop socialism, hardly even talk about socialism these days. So in the late 80s, she thought the European Union was getting too integrated. There was talk of having a single currency one day, of turning into European Union, and she said, no, we can't have the, I can't remember, the European Commission as the executive, the European Parliament as our legislature, the European Court of Justice as our judiciary. That was just too much integration for her. So the exchange rate mechanism was mooted. that the Deutschmark, being the most potent currency, not the most valuable, but the most important one in Western Europe, must lead the others. And the pound, the French franc, would all, and so on, will be pegged to that and go up and down with the Deutschmark. And she was dead against it. But most of her party were in favour of it, as indeed was the Labour Party and indeed the Lib Dems, the SNP, everybody really, just not the not the Ulster Unionists. So then she was brought down by Geoffrey Howe, who was resigned as Chancellor of Exchequer for some time as Deputy Prime Minister. She'd also brought in the community charge a year beforehand, a new way of taxing people, and it was taxing people, not houses. And you could easily avoid it by simply not registering to vote. So people said that will force a lot of low-income people, i.e. mainly Labour voters, off the electoral roll, and the Conservatives will win forever. But anyway, she introduced it in Scotland before the rest of the United Kingdom. People say, oh, she was trying it out in Scotland because she was anti-North British. No, Conservatives say it's because the rates came up for review there earlier on. And the Conservative Party was still reasonably strong in Scotland in 1989. By the end of the 90s, the party was very feeble, lost all its seats in 97. Anyway, there were huge strikes and riots and people refusing to pay and people going to prison. The Labour Party was led by Neil Kinnock, and he said, lawmakers must not be lawbreakers. Even if we detest this, we're still going to pay it. Some judges resigned rather than send people to prison for not paying it. And the Labour Party dubbed it the poll tax, an allusion to 1381, to the Peasants' Revolt. And it cost a lot more to collect than it brought in. And many people who were lifelong Conservatives were disgusted by this. So it really wasn't working. But you become very hubristic, and no matter how difficult, full steam ahead, even when things seemed disastrous, she'd been very steadfast, and she'd said, no backing down. There was a Thatcherite group called the No Turning Back group, and her Ginger group said, Prime Minister, you must go for it. So she tended to surround herself at that stage with these handsome young men who were smooth talkers, the sort of good-looking flatterers who would have overlooked her when she was in her 20s because she was too much of a blue stocking. And they just caressed her ego and encouraged her to be even more uncompromising. Turned out to be cataclysmic. You can't be Prime Minister forever. And then Sir Anthony Mayer, this little-known MP from Wales, he'd stood against her and done it surprisingly well in 1989 in his leadership challenge, but failed. And finally, Geoffrey Howe really signalled the fall of Thatcher in November 1990. And so who was standing against her? It was then John Major, Douglas Hurd and Heseltine came into the election when she was hull below the waterline. She'd actually got 55% of Conservative MPs to vote for her. So she could have carried on as leader, but she was persuaded by people she trusted that it was time to go. Alan Clark, one of her loyal consiglieres, say, you've got to go. And her husband said, Margaret, it is time to fall on your sword. Previously, she said, I fight on to win. And the Conservatives were well behind in the polls. They thought they were going to be absolutely wiped out by Labour at the election, which was due to be only a year and a half away. Anyway, so she decided to stand down as Prime Minister, and a week later, a new leader had emerged. Major had defeated Heseltine, who led the wet wing of the party, who'd resigned from her cabinet in 1987, and Douglas Hurd, who seemed to have the pedigree, as in Eton, he was at Cambridge, and he'd been in the Foreign Office. But no, it was John Major, this working-class boy from Brixton, who had no higher education. He became Prime Minister. But I won't go into him too much. So that was that. But she became too much of a backseat driver under Major, publicly criticising what it was doing too much and being increasingly shrill and Eurosceptic, being dead against the euro. Should the United Kingdom join the euro currency? Well, first of all, join the European Union. No. European Economic Community, yes. EU, no. That was her attitude. So the Bruges group had applauded her Bruges speech of 1989, saying, we mustn't push this European integration too far. So she'd got inflation down, but unemployment had increased massively and also been very regionally concentrated. Certain places in Northern England and Scotland were really wrecked by that, in Wales, particularly in the south. Northern Ireland had high unemployment anyway because of the Troubles. And that led to more drug abuse, more crime. Crime tripled under the Tories, who were supposed to be tough on crime. There's a miners' strike, which I forgot to mention, 1984 to 1985. when she said, we're going to have to close some mines. There are about 180,000 miners in the UK. We're going to have to slim it down to 160,000. Some mines are just not profitable. We're importing cheaper coal from Czechoslovakia and Poland. And so they went on strike without a ballot. I won't tell the whole tale. But anyway, eventually she won. And mining scarcely exists in the UK these days because it's just too expensive. And we have other ways to get energy. So she said, are you one of us? Are you a Thatcherite like me? Her 1983 election victory transformed her from having a modest majority to having a very healthy majority, a landslide victory, partly because the anti-Conservative vote was split between Labour, which got only 27%, and the SDP Liberal Alliance, which got 25%. And what else? So she was really confirmed as a very strong leader, and she disliked the wets in her own party, the moderates, who often came from a more upper-class background, where this paternalistic attitude towards the proletariat. So she was certainly a divisive figure, but you can't be all things to all people. You've got to know your mind. Anyway, I remember she went and spoke at my school in about 1993, and I said, if you value peace more than prestige, why wouldn't you negotiate with extremists? You know, like people hostage takers or the IRA and so on. She said, well, peace at what price? Obviously, that's some things we can't give away for peace. So she believed in being firm about things like that. And Martin McGuinness said the first meeting he had with the British government official was a month before Thatcher left office, who said there'll be no negotiation, there'll be no compromise, there'll be no backing down. That's it. So many people would find that admirable. So she is abominated in some quarters, and she didn't let that get to her. So I have mixed feelings about her. That high unemployment is really bad news in all sorts of ways. I don't understand economics. Perhaps reducing inflation was more important, but it's hard for people to believe that if they're the ones who are losing their jobs. So the Conservative Party faced all sorts of problems after her, and they couldn't make up their mind. Do we endorse her legacy? Do we reject her legacy? But it's actually quite a long time ago now, so people don't really care. So Thatcher, she was perhaps too convinced of her own rectitude, too hectoring, and then she was always going to get a hard time as a woman. You can be seen as feeble, and then if you're firm, then you're seen as a termagant. So she's certainly significant. I don't think anyone could deny that. But I suppose I tend to be more of a Tory wet.